Hello and welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage. Late afternoon on a Monday here in July 2023. It's a beautiful day. Warm temperature, but the humidity level's been dropping down a little bit, so it's not so bad. After I shoot this video, maybe have a snack, I'm gonna mow the lawn. Take advantage of these long evenings before it gets dark. But right now, we're gonna talk about the 4L80E transmission. Coincidentally, 2 years ago Saturday, last Saturday I believe, 2 years ago, I did a video, which I rewatched the other day, on the 4L80E, and I went over pretty much the year breaks and the external differences and dove inside a little bit, checked the ohming out the solenoids and stuff like that. So I think it's actually a pretty good video, 20-something minutes long, and I'll put a link to it either in the comments or in the description of this video, this one right here. So I think that's the only other 4L80E video I've done. I haven't looked. But anyway, we're going to do another one today. So in preparation for making this video, the other day while this 4L80E that I'm repairing for a friend, before I took it apart, and while I had another Turbo 400 sitting here, it's hard not to make comparisons between the two because they're a lot alike. And a lot of this video is going to be comparing them. So starting off, it is perceived that they are much heavier weight-wise than a Turbo 400. So I had to put them on the scale. So using my crane that sits on the bench here and my bathroom scale, and I did some rounding up just to make it easy to remember for me and you. A Turbo 400 without a torque converter and drained of its oil, so just an empty transmission. A Turbo 400 is 135 pounds, and the same situation in the 4L80E, no converter, no oil, 185 pounds. And that's just the bare transmission. That's 50 pounds. And if you compare a stock Turbo 400 torque converter to a stock 4L80E torque converter that has a lockup clutch inside, that's probably gonna be 15 to 20 pounds heavier as well. I did not weigh those yet. I'll have to do that in the future. But it's safe to say complete 65, 70 pounds heavier in a 4L80E. So why would you want one? Well, a Turbo 400 that I've made over 100 videos on. I haven't added them up lately or looked at my totals, but we've talked about that thing inside out. To this day, still the choice of most all fast drag race cars anyway, off-road vehicles, street cars, trucks, whatever. Still a good choice. However, it is a direct drive transmission. 3-speed, first, second, third. Third is high gear, 1-to-1. The input shaft and the output shaft turn 1-to-1 in high gear. So along about 91 or 2, General Motors decided to tackle a heavy-duty overdrive. They had the 700R4 originally, turned into the 4L60E. That's been around since the early 80s. Funny to talk about overdrive. You know, the American manufacturers in the late 50s were equipping vehicles with overdrive. That went away through the muscle car era and the first couple gas crunches in the 70s. It wasn't until the early 80s before they really got after the fuel economy with an overdrive transmission and a lockup torque converter. So what does that do for you if you're not familiar? A Turbo 400 3-speed with a torque converter, hydraulic coupler. A torque converter without a lockup clutch always has some slip. It isn't 1-to-1. It's close when you're at highway speed, but there's always some slippage. It's a fluid coupling. It's not gears. It's not direct. So to combat that and make it one-to-one from the engine to the input shaft of the transmission, they put a clutch inside the torque converter, and when that is turned on, the torque converter in and out is the same. So that goes one-to-one, and the transmission, if you have overdrive, the output shaft turns faster than the input shaft. In the case of the 4L80E, 25%. This has a 0.75 overdrive, so the engine's turning 25% slower than the drive shaft, plus the reduction of RPM with a lockup torque converter. That makes a cruising machine. So despite the weight and the fact that it has most of the Turbo 400 parts intact inside, makes it a pretty nice choice for a heavy-duty street car, drag race car. There's parts you can buy. I guess they're pretty reliable to, I don't know, pick a number. Again, it's horsepower, weight, and traction that breaks things. 1,000, 12 to 1,500 horsepower. I think you can buy enough parts to make a 4L80E live at that. But you have a lot more rotating weight and overall weight to deal with. So there's drawbacks, but I can tell you, like my LS Swap Dodge, when you got it in overdrive and the converter's locked up, that makes an old vehicle drive like a new one. Gone are, all the buzzing and the RPMs and the poor fuel economy. Suddenly you're whistling down the road with traffic, no problem. So that makes it worthwhile. But let's take a look inside and see what the differences are. All right, here we are. I sat down so you can see me. I don't want you to think I'm lazy, but I wanted to be in the picture today. So, in the front row, this is the internals of a Turbo 400 from behind the front pump. That's the input shaft, which goes into the forward drum. That's locked into the direct drum. And that is a lower unit, the gear set, if you will. And what happens with these two clutch drums plus another set of clutches, the intermediate clutches, second gear here, you're essentially rotating or holding or stopping these two shafts right here, which make the planetaries come up with two speeds. First gear, second gear, and then when everything's locked together, one-to-one. So, if this stuff in the back looks familiar, we'll work backwards forward. This is the lower gear set. In the first few years of the 4L80E, they share a lot of parts. Later on, if you watch the first video, or I'll tell you now, the early 4L80Es have the cool lines like they were traditionally in the front, above each other, above and below, on the back side of the bell housing on the passenger side. And the hot converter oil goes out to the cooler. We talked about lubrication circuit in the 400 just the other day. And it comes back in the upper fitting and lubes the transmission, front to back. The lube is pressurized coming back from the cooler, and it lubes everything all the way to the tail housing and the bushing in the back of the case. Along about 1999-ish, the 4L80E went away from that, and now they had one cooler line in the front, which is hot converter oil out to the cooler, and they dumped it back in to the center support. Right here, there's a little seal in the fitting. I'll show you. The front fitting is short like they used to be. The back fitting is long, and it goes into a seal in the center support, and it lubes that way. So, major changes. You'll also notice there's a tone ring right here. These lugs here and these short lugs here are for park. When you engage park, there's a dog that fits in there, keeps your drive shaft and you from rolling away. Next to that, on a 4L80E two-wheel drive, they've pressed on a tone ring. On a four-wheel drive, this is the tone ring for the front. There's always an input speed sensor on a 4L80E, but a four-wheel drive, they use the tone ring output sensor in the transfer case. So, converting, and we're going to do this in the upcoming weeks, we're going to convert a two-wheel drive 4L80E we're going to convert a four-wheel drive 4L80E to two-wheel drive, and we're going to have to add the tone ring, potentially. Easy to tell if you have one or not. If you have an input sensor and an output sensor in the transmission well, you got both tone rings. You always have the front one. If you have an input speed sensor, the speed sensors are the same, but if you have an input speed sensor and a plug in the back on a four-wheel drive case, you got to pull the plug out and see if the tone ring is there, because sometimes it is, often it's not. And you got to buy it, it's $30-something, and press it on there, and you can retrofit, but it's one more part to buy when you're converting to four-wheel drive. So moving ahead, the direct drum, we already know, if you watch my videos, interchanges into the 400, it's an upgrade, because most of your 4L80Es, especially after 1997, have a 34-element Sprag, heavy-duty piece. Yeah, the pistons interchange, the clutches interchanges, no difference there. The biggest difference, and I wish, in a perfect world, if it was possible, General Motors would have made the overdrive section some kind of add-on to the Turbo 400. Again, this is in dream world now, but they could have kept manufacturing the Turbo 400 as it was and just had a little unit in the back that may be sandwiched in between the transmission and the transfer case, or just the drive shaft for two-wheel drive. But they didn't do that. They put the overdrive unit in the front. I'm sure it's a packaging thing, and in upcoming videos I'll give you the measurements of how much longer the 4L80E is compared to the Turbo 400. It's only a few inches, but they managed to put all this junk that makes overdrive work essentially into the forward drum area. So I've had this stretched out, but in reality there's only 3 or 4 inches difference probably in the overall length of the transmission. So what we have going on here is the forward clutch drum on the back looks very similar. In fact, the hub interchanges, the intermediate clutches interchange somewhat, and pretty familiar from here back on both units. What's different is we now have what they call a fourth clutch, and this is an overrun clutch. There's a small set of clutches in here that we need to talk about, but essentially what happens is when you engage the fourth clutch and hold the outside of this, you're now slowing down the input shaft 25% by the use of a set of planetaries. So that's pretty cool. Drastic difference in driving. Now this is where you need to pay attention. If you have a vehicle, now I'm about 20, 30 years too late to tell you this, but I've told it to you before. Since the introduction of the 4L80E, there is a roller clutch in the overrun clutch. You're familiar with a roller clutch? You could call it it's a one-way clutch like a Sprag is, but you can see how big this one is. The one inside the overrun clutch is probably 2 inches around, maybe. It's very small. And if you're familiar with your park reverse neutral, in a 4L80E you have D4, which is the one you probably always put it in, the next one down from neutral. And then you have D3, D2, and D1. So you can hold it in manual low, second gear, third gear, or most people just put it in D4 and drive. Most of the time that's perfectly acceptable. With the exception of when you're going to work the transmission, because in D3, D2, and D1, there's a set of clutches in here that help to hold, along with the roller clutch, to help to hold the power transfer. In D4, the clutches are not applied, helping. All the strain is through the roller clutch and the overrun clutch. This little ring. I mean, it's a weak spot for sure. And if you're going to do anything stupid, hard on the transmission in D4, you're probably going to hurt it. Now, there's a lot of aftermarket valve body upgrades and stuff that have tried to make it so if you were to do that, they would increase the pressure and somehow save the transmission. That's not super popular modification. So you really need to know, like if you're plowing snow, if you have a 4-wheel drive truck with a 4L80E in it, which again, I'm a few decades late because everything now has a 6L 80 or 90 in it. So that's a subject for another day. But if you're plowing snow, you got to go to D3. So you have both units holding the power transmission through your converter, through your transmission. You know what I mean? Otherwise, you're putting all that strain on half of the holding power. You're cutting it in half. So I'm generalizing a lot here, but that is an important point to take away learning about the 4L80E transmission. I'm going to close out this video because time's flying already and it's already longer than I expected. Talking about shift kits for a 4L80E transmission. I've mentioned many times while shooting Turbo 400 videos that I have to be really careful when I open up a transmission that I'm going to modify to find all the old modifications that may not necessarily jive with what I'm trying to do. So that's why I get excited when I find a virgin transmission that's probably never been apart before, because at least it's all stock. And every time you buy like a Transbrake valve body, they're expecting you to start with an unmodified transmission. You got to be sharp enough to know if it is or not. Now, in the case of the 4L80E, in the first 15 to 20 years of them being around, Transgo, the HD2 shift kit, became really popular. And I'm not going to tell you it doesn't work. I will tell you I've never bought one. But when somebody has bought one and had it installed, there's permanent modifications that are not going to work. And you got to make different choices because of it. I mean, holes have been drilled in the pump, in the valve body. Again, if you went and got another pump and valve body, I could probably modify this transmission the way I want to. Like when I can still dual feed the direct clutches just like you can in a Turbo 400. But because it has the HD2 kit, they do it with the separated plate and valve body modifications. And once that's done, I can't do both. So I like to, which I talked about in the first video I made, I can duplicate, if not improve upon. I can mechanically dual feed the direct clutch. I can drill a couple holes, block accumulators if I want to, and make a really firm shifting, but that is more programming, but a stronger transmission, one that's going to be able to take more power, more clamping force is what you're always looking for. As far as hard shifting, that with an electronic transmission is at your fingertips. Like I've told the story in my Dodge, that transmission is old, the oil was black. I never even opened it up. I put a filter in it, new fluid, and we tuned it up electronically, and it's for 5 or 6, 7 years now, it has been wailing out the shifts. I don't know why it hasn't even spit the teeth out of the inside of the case for the intermediate clutch, because it really nails second gear. But it hasn't. It's almost an experiment at this point. It's science, but when it comes to valve bodies for a Turbo 400, you can, again, the HD2 is still for sale, Transgo. You can go online just like you can with the Turbo 400 and do your own shift kit. My preferred method, one, you don't have to buy anything. I already have drill bits, and I can put a 3/8 cut plate. I can dual feed this just like I do the 400 for pennies. I don't need to spend a couple $100 for a shift kit. But when you decide to buy a valve body, there are kits you can buy, at least you could, and I've installed them in the past to make your own Transbrake. It's called the D3 Transbrake. D3 because, like I told you, you can't do it in D4, you're going to hurt the transmission, but you can have a Transbrake work in D3. They also make a D1, I believe. That means it's a manual shift, probably. But that's a kit. I mean, you modify your own valve body. They give you some parts. And then you can actually buy both electronic shifting valve bodies, because this is an electronic transmission. It shifts on 12 volts. the solenoids, input and output sensors, the torque converter clutch is electronic, and like I mentioned in the other video, the torque converter clutch has a pulse width modulated valve with GM's intent to make it so smooth you don't feel it. Well, what that means is it's not going to last as long. In the programming, once you open up, the transmission tuning, you can just make that on and off, which is my choice. It's going to feel like another shift. It's going to, be firm and last longer. A firm shift means you're not wearing stuff inside the transmission. And you can buy manual valve bodies. You can manually shift it using electronics. You can homemade wiring. There's actually videos online of having switches on your dash and all that stuff. But what I think is the trickiest piece, if you want to put, if you have a hot rod and you don't mind manually shifting it, buy a full manual valve body with or without a trans brake. ATD makes these, and among others. And you have a full manual valve body, and when you put it in fourth, it also locks the torque converter hydraulically. No wiring involved unless you have a trans brake. Then you just got to run your 12 volts to your trans brake solenoid. But if you don't want to mess with electronics, but want an overdrive and a lockup, that's going to be a heck of a transmission. So I'm actually looking forward to building one of those for myself to put in something. I don't know. I got lots of projects, but if you want overdrive and don't necessarily want it electronically controlled, of course, if you're going to have a Holley Terminator, say, if you're going to buy that anyway, if you buy that's the Terminator Max, if you buy the Terminator X Max, that has transmission control. It's pretty much plug and play, and you can tune shift quality, firmness, speeds. It's all in your fingertips too. And you don't have to buy a valve body because a 480E valve body is fairly expensive. You're gonna probably kill $1,000 buying a valve body. That's most of a Terminator X Max by Holley electronic control system, which also runs your engine. So that's a lot of information. I'm going to call it quits right here. My head hurts. I can't imagine how you're feeling. But if you're a fan of this transmission, for good reason, again, it's an overgrown Turbo 400, and it'll be around a long time. Personally, the 6L80s and 90s, I want nothing to do with, and the aftermarket really hasn't grabbed onto them either. I'm not sure at what point the engineers decided we needed more than 4 speeds in an automatic. 6 to 10 is now the norm, and I don't know if we need it. I have a 6-speed in my Suburban. It's just shifting all the time, but in the end, it doesn't do anything different than this does. It doesn't get better mileage. It's not more drivable. It's not as reliable. It's more expensive to fix. But anyway, thanks for watching. We're going to do more 4L80E content in the future, and I hope when I do my next 4L80E video that I'm not comparing it to a Turbo 400 and keep saying the wrong one. But I did, and again, every video comes with at least one mistake and an old sock somewhere. Take care.